Hello there. I've got a question from Canby, Oregon, and I'm going to answer this in kind of a general way. Should you have any specific questions that you'd like to ask in response to what it is that I'm about to say, then please do feel free to send me those questions directly by email to aaron@aaronbudgeon.net. And this question is just a general kind of question of what is the purpose of the law? What's happening is that this person is having some conversations with some people who are a part of a certain religious group, and they believe that they are to live in obedience to the Mosaic law, in a sense, and so this has inspired a lot of different conversations, and a lot of interesting questions have been asked as a result of it. I, of course, have a lot of experience with these and similar kinds of groups. And the subject as a whole, because it was very important to me at one time in my life as well to try and live in obedience to the Mosaic law. But I look at things a little bit differently now, and I'll explain why. The first thing that you ought to do when having a conversation with somebody about the purpose of the law is you really have to ask that individual who you're communicating with, why do they want to embrace the law for themselves? What do they really hope to gain from their pursuit of their obedience to God? What is their purpose? And what is it that they are going to try to achieve? All right. Now, this is an important question to ask, and I have asked this question of a lot of people myself. From my experience, the most common kind of answer that I've gotten from people is that they want to be separate from others. You know, that this is a way to kind of separate themselves from others, that there are the others who do not try to live in obedience to God, and there is them, you know, these people who do try to live in obedience to God. Now, of course, there are lots of religious groups, you know, and I'll just reduce it down to the Christian groups just for the sake of simplicity. There are a lot of Christian groups who want to be obedient to God. The question is, well, to what degree, you know, to how much? And this is where you end up getting different churches, different denominations, based on, well, what are the ways that we are going to be obedient to God, you know, and what are the ways that you have decided you want to be obedient to God. All right, but most of this is motivated by a desire to be separate, you know, to be unique. And I'll tell you that probably the biggest motive as to why people are trying to accomplish this is so that they can compare themselves with other people and assert that they are better than somebody else. All right? This tends to be the pursuit of religious pride, is what it becomes for most people. Why do you want to live in obedience to the law? Well, so that I can be separate, so I can be unique, and so I can compare myself with other people who are not as obedient to God. And of course, God will like me more than he will like you. You know, and that's what it usually comes down to. There's another motive that is extremely popular, and yet people find it difficult to say because they don't want it to be known so much. There's another reason, and this is so that they may be blessed. Okay? And that tends to be left a little bit open-ended. They won't tell you exactly how they would like to be blessed necessarily, or how they expect to be blessed. But there is an expectation that they are going to be blessed because of their obedience to God as is defined by the law. All right? So one, you know, it has to do with being separate, unique, and gives an opportunity for religious pride. The other has to do with being blessed. And this, of course, is just a general description. It's kind of open-ended. You have to ask the individuals, well, what is your interest? What are your interests? What do you hope to gain? What do you hope to be different in your life because you are living in obedience to God, you know? And now this idea of being obedient to God, this differs from various people. Some people will say, well, this is the list of laws that we observe to say that we are obedient to God, and there is another list that other people use in order to say that they are obedient to God. All right, so that's just an open-ended description to say that I want to be obedient to God. Well, all right, so what does that mean? You really have to ask a lot of questions based on what people are saying and what people are thinking, what people are wanting, and the variations are just enormous. There's no way to answer everything all at one time. There's just no way to do that. And so this becomes a living experience that a person has in their life, all right? And your experiences, just because you're going to be dealing with different people than I am dealing with today, your experiences are going to be a little bit different from mine. Now, I've been doing this for a long time, and so chances are I've run into people who are quite similar to the people who you are engaged in, so I can be of help in order to navigate through some of these things. Do feel free to ask me specific questions, and I'll see what I can do, to see if I can be of help. And if I don't think I can be, I'm pretty good at responding that way and just saying, sorry, but I can't help with this one. This one is just not something I think I can really help with. But there's others that I can do really well with. All right, so that's where I would start, is what do you hope to gain by living in obedience to the law? All right, the next thing to talk about when it comes to the purpose of the law is you have to consider, well, what was God's intention? What is he trying to accomplish? What is he trying to do? What are the problems that he is trying to solve? All right, now let's start with the law that was given through Moses. All right, now that law was given by God in order to define the nation of Israel. All right, he's got all these people that he's set free from slavery, and he's going to define them as a people by saying, this is how you are going to relate to one another, and this is how you are going to relate to me. That's what that law was. And so when you go into the Old Testament and you look at the law that was given as part of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, when you go through those sections in the scriptures, that's the primary intent, is to define a nation of people and to define the rules by which they are going to relate to one another and how they are going to relate to their God. All right, and so that's the first thing to keep in mind. And when you do, it will help with a lot of concerns and a lot of issues that usually come up, especially when there are unique laws that can only really be observed in the context of the national identity, in the context of the nation. Just to give you an example, consider the festivals, which tend to be quite popular because they appear to be easy to obey. You can really only observe these according to the law if you're going to say that you observe them. And in order to observe them effectively, you do need to have access to Jerusalem and the land of Israel, and there needs to be some degree of infrastructure and allowances that are there that will enable you to fulfill what it is that you want to fulfill. All right, so there's just a lot to it, and the dependencies do have to do with the national identity. All right, there are a lot of laws that are like that, and as you study them, you'll be able to sort them out and see, well, this can only work. This is only going to really be possible and effective and for the purpose that God intended if we have the nation of Israel intact. And that just hasn't really been the case for a long time. Even today, there is the national Israel in the land right now, but they don't function according to the Mosaic law. They function with some of the laws, but not enough of them in order to observe all of the commandments in the way that you would probably expect. Okay, so even today, there's plenty of variation. All right, that's the first thing that I would like to mention concerning the purpose of the law, to define the nation of Israel. The next purpose is for pretty much everyone, to one extent or another, and that is to stir up sin. All right? And I know this might seem a little awkward because you would think that God would give the law so that there would be a reduction of sin. And, in some ways, there could be. All right? There could very well be be a reduction of sin in some ways, but there are lots of other ways that there will be an increase in sin. So when I've thought about this a lot, when I consider this and have conversations with people about this subject, we tend to agree. I tend to come to the conclusion that the net result, there may be a few good things, a little bit of a reduction of sin, but there will be an increase in sin in so many other ways that the net result will end up being an increase in sin. All right, and these things are things that you will find in the letters that Paul wrote in the New Testament as he gave an explanation of the purpose of the law. I've done verse-by-verse studies through Living God Ministries. You can find them in the Living God Ministries radio archive. Also on video on the channel Aaron Budgen and the other channel Aaron Budgen Live. On these two channels, there's a presentation on Hebrews where I spoke about this. On the Aaron Budgen channel, it's a more refined version of the study on the book of Hebrews. The one in Aaron Budgen Live was a live presentation. So I did the live presentation, and then I did another one for Aaron Budgen in order to try to give a better presentation as a verse-by-verse study through the book of Hebrews. And so if there's a particular verse that you find that is related to this topic of the purpose of the law and how it stirs up sin and how it was used and why it was used and what people are trying to use it for, if you have a specific verse, you can go to these audio recordings in the Living God Ministries radio archive or some of the videos that I did for the verse-by-verse studies, and you'll probably find them there, and it's likely that I will have something to say about what it is that you're thinking about. All right, so it does stir up sin. Now, there are four fundamental ways that I personally recognize as being ways that the law will stir up sin. The first way is just the natural rebellion of humanity. If somebody tells you, "Now don't be doing this," don't do that. You can have this tendency within you to say, "Well, now don't be telling me what to do and what not to do. I'm going to do it just because. I'm going to show you that, you can't tell me what to do." There's just this natural rebellion in humanity. And some people have this a little bit more than others. It just depends on the person and the subject as to how a person may respond, how they might react. But just this alone will stir up a lot of sin. Okay, there's the natural rebellion of humanity. There's also the subject of God giving us things to think about that we probably would have never thought about otherwise. There are some sins that you probably just would have never given any thought to at all. It just doesn't have any meaning to you whatsoever until somebody said, now don't be doing this. And you're thinking, okay, yeah, so I won't do that. That seems kind of interesting. Oh, I think I'd like to try that. It's just something that happens as a consequence of being presented with the law. Paul used this example with the subject of coveting. He said, "I would not have known what it was to covet unless the law said don't covet, and then it stirred up within me every covetous desire." Don't covet what? Don't covet that. All right, fine. Gosh, that looks kind of nice. And so that's what the law will do. It will stir up sin in that way. Okay, well, then there's the people who believe that they have succeeded. What happens if you're successful and you do obey the law? Let's just assume that you do so to the point where you feel that God would approve, that he would say, "Oh, yes, you have done it." All right, well, now you got this new thing that you're going to have to deal with, and that's something called religious pride. All right, and religious pride requires someone else to compare yourself with. You got to have somebody else, somebody who's not observing the law. And when you find somebody else who's not like you are, then you'll compare yourself with them. You'll esteem a sense of pride and a sense of value because, of course, you're not like them. And the way that you will relate to them and other people in the world, there will be opportunities for you to relate to them in negative ways, and the way that you relate to others will change through this religious pride, such that there will be expressions of sin through the way that you relate to other people. And you might wonder, well, how could that be? Well, let me just give you something to think about. All right. When I talk with people, sometimes I will mention that religious people can be some of the meanest people you ever run across in your life. And, maybe you can't relate to that, but there are a lot of other people who can definitely relate to that in a big way. And they would say that they were sinned against. Somebody sinned upon them. These religious people, through their religious pride, they feel violated. That, that these people do not love them as they love themselves. That's for sure. Just to give you an example, just to tell you that this is a topic, something to think about. It's a direction to go in. All right? So you have the natural rebellion of humanity. You've got the giving of things that you probably never would have thought about doing to begin with. You've got religious pride that shows up afterwards. Here's another thing that happens. All right? The next thing that happens quite often is that when a person fails, okay, we've got the religious pride when a person thinks that they succeeded. But when a person fails, well, now you've got some condemnation from God in your life. He is disgusted with you. He's ashamed to know who you are. If somebody was to ask God, hey, you know so-and-so? He would say, yeah, let's talk about somebody else. And how is that going to make you feel when you've blown it? You failed. You're sinning. That's the way it is. And God is turning his back on you because that's what people believe. That he really holds your sins against you. What's going to happen now? Well, you deep down inside do have a need for acceptance. He created you to have that need. And obviously, he is not going to meet that need now, according to these beliefs. Now, is he? No, he will not. So, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to have to go somewhere else. You're going to have to go do something else. If you want to feel some sense of peace in your heart when it comes to the need for acceptance, don't be looking to God anymore, because you've sinned. All right? And he knows it. So, you're going to have to go into the world and find some acceptance there, which means you're going to need some more sin in your life. I know it's awful, but that's how it works out. You're going to need some sin in your life in order to get a break from all the religious pressure that you have been under. You really are. Now, this is a really big struggle for religious leaders. All right? It really is. Because you'll hear them preaching from the pulpit, don't sin, God will hate you, kind of thing. And in many cases, they're preaching to themselves. They won't say it to you, But I have conversations with people who are in this situation often, and they're preaching to themselves, just hoping that maybe they will inspire themselves, and that maybe they'll get it themselves and they'll stop whatever sin they're dealing with that they're doing, because they're trying to get a break from all the religious pressure that they're under. It's a real struggle that a lot of people have, and when they are very religious, in this context, the more they are, the more they tend to need some sin in their life in order to just get a break, in order to just kind of get away and just rest a little bit from all the make sure you do this and make sure you don't do that kind of life. And it's unfortunate, there is a better way, all right? There is another way. Living in the new covenant, from what I understand, living in the inheritance in Christ has nothing to do with this at all. But when people want to live according to the law or a system of law or a subset of the law, whenever they say we live to obey God, and you answer that question, all right, well, what's the list in order to say that you do that? That's their law. That's what they live by, and it will, no matter what it is, it will have the same effect. It will still stir up sin no matter what. And even if a person does not believe in God at all, everyone has their own idea of the way things should be and the way things should not be. And that is a system of law for them. And it will do the same, and it can be used in the same way. And why would God want there to be an increase in sin, through all of this? What's he doing? What's he thinking, right? Well, the idea is that when a person has such an increase in sin, and it just doesn't go away, it gets worse in some cases even, the hope is that one day a person will recognize that if they're going to be right with God, then there really is no hope. There just isn't. There is no hope at all. If you think you got this little glimmer of hope, oh, don't worry, I'll do my part. Well, you're not done yet. You need some more sin in your life. Which means you need some more law in your life. Or you're not committed enough. You're not devoted enough to obey God. You just repent. You're not there. You've settled. You've found some point of being comfortable. But no, you need to keep going, and so that you will run out of hope. There should be no hope whatsoever. And when you finally get to that point of absolute despair, then you will see that the only way is the grace and mercy of God. That's all you will have left. And then you can get started. All right? That's when you can get started in the new relationship in the new covenant. You can really get started in the new relationship based on his grace and mercy. Because before then, if you haven't reached that point of absolute despair yet, well, you've still got some law in your life that you're living by, and there's just not a lot that God can do. All right, now this is just a general summary and a general direction. When a person gets saved and embraces a new covenant, we do still have lots of law in our life, and it is a continual struggle that will go on until we are dead. If you don't believe me, you just wait another, few days or a few months or a few years or whatever, and you'll find that you're struggling with the subject in one way or another in some aspect of your life. It's something that never goes away. I think it's a wonderful thing, and it's a good thing that will continually remind us of the need for the grace and mercy of God. And each iteration of the struggle, every time we get into it with ourselves, each time there will always be a greater sense of faith when we're done with it. When we're done with it for a period of time and then we get lost in it again later. These cycles of struggles are good. They do increase the magnitude of our dependency on our God over time. All right, so enjoy that struggle over time. So the stirring up sin is a wonderful reason for having the law. There's also the prophetic inferences and foreshadowings. There were a lot of things that God spoke of, that he related through the law that were prophetic, that were foreshadowings of other things that he would explain later. For example, the laws related to Passover were somewhat prophetic as they described how God would accomplish salvation, being the Passover lamb. There are some prophetic things that can be expressed through the law. The foreshadowings, I think my favorite would definitely be the Sabbath law. That the Sabbath law was given in the context of a physical rest, but this foreshadowed a spiritual rest that would be available later because of what he would do through the Messiah. So those are important reasons for the law. What else do I have here? This was a good one. This is what started to begin with, and that was the conflict between God and humanity in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve violated the law because they believed that if they knew what was good and evil, then they could be like God. The law that they violated was don't eat from that tree. That was it. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so that opened the question, do we really live according to the knowledge of good and evil or not? Is that how God designed us to live? Is that going to be real? Is that going to be accomplished? That was a question that was raised right from the beginning. And this needs to be answered. This needs to be resolved. All right? So, he certainly gave humanity lots of time, lots of opportunity to come up with a way of life, a way of living, according to some knowledge of good and evil on their own. He gave people lots of time to do that. And then through the nation of Israel, he said, well, here's my contribution. I'll give you this law as my contribution towards this great effort of, can you be like God if you know what's good and evil? Well, here you go. Here's a definition of what's good and evil. This is a purpose of the law. It's another purpose, a very important one. These are some good reasons. And of course, the answer is no, it does not work out at all. All right. Through the law, we can learn a lot about the character and the person of our God. And that's just by studying it as you do. Ask the Lord to share with you. Well, considering what you just said, what does that say about you? What can I understand about you through what you presented here? So there's a lot of opportunity for that. You just have to be more specific about what it is that you're looking at when it comes to that subject. And that's a personal experience as we grow and know our God as a person individually. All right. Now, this is a good one to give us insights on how the problems of relational conflict can be solved or how more can be created. All right. This is something that I've discovered as I have continued to study the law since I understood the new covenant and the gospel and our life in Christ. I'll still read the law just in order to look for opportunities to discover new things and to give the Holy Spirit more opportunities to speak to me about certain things. And there are some very interesting laws that just might seem a little out of place or might seem a little odd, or I just simply may not like. I think, well, I don't know, I'm not sure about that one. And in studying these, there is an opportunity for God to speak to us and say, well, look, with this law, then people will relate to each other in a certain way. All right? And you'll find that if they relate to each other under that basis, then there will be a reduction of relational conflict. All right? And when I look at some of these laws, of which of course are the total opposite of how we live today, or how other people have lived in history when they have had laws in their societies and in their communities, or cultural ways that people relate to each other that are the opposite of what these laws have established. When they are the opposite, what happens? Well, there is a lot of relational conflict and relational problems that take place. And so when the law is followed, those kinds of problems will not likely happen, or at least not as much. But when those laws are not followed, well, we have these other kinds of problems that seem to erupt and are worse than what we would have otherwise. So there is a way to understand our relationships with each other and our relationships with the world in general that God can speak to you about and say, this law solved these kinds of dynamics. These laws solved these kinds of concerns. And it doesn't mean that we have to try to figure out how to impose these laws on our society or on our world. It doesn't mean that we have to do that or that we're going to be punished by God if we don't. It just means that we can have discernment and understanding through the eyes of our God that other people just simply won't have. And if we do have that, then we can make decisions for ourselves in terms of how we might decide to relate to other people that can be a better way to have relationships with one another. All right, so those are some reasons that I came up with regards to the purpose of the law. I'm going to stop with this and just say that this is a general open-ended kind of response, open-ended kind of answer, and it will perhaps inspire some new questions that may come to mind that you may think about. Well, Aaron, now, well, what about this and what about that? And so this is the opportunity to go ahead and send me an email. Send it to me and I'll see what I can do. Send those questions to Aaron@aaronbudgeon.net. Thanks.